All right, everyone, our good friend Maduro has seen his country slowly slide into irrelevance despite having the most oil in the entire world, and it's continuing. There are two-day strikes by the opposition there. More people died, burning cars, rubber bullets being fired, and tear gas. It's basically like, imagine if one of those global summits was going on every single day for several years at a time, and that's what parts of Venezuela have devolved into. And this comes on the heels, of course, of everything else that's already happened there. The nationalization of certain industries, including foreign-owned companies, foreign-owned factories, which means that they're no longer producing anything. Chronic shortages, food shortages, certainly. I liked the propaganda that came out of Venezuela by some socialist lovers of Maduro, where they showed off the one store that had stuff in it that nobody can actually afford to buy, of course, which is why it's still stocked, as though that was evidence there was no shortage of goods within Venezuela. Oh, here's a picture of a couple of aisles that have stuff in them because it's too expensive for anybody to actually obtain at this point, unless they happen to be Maduro or somebody very close to Maduro. See, there's no problem in Venezuela. People are just making a big stink over nothing. Our economy contracted by double digits. Inflation has taken hold. And everybody in the entire region is condemning our El Presidente. But just ignore all of that and ignore the mounting death toll. And then they put out more propaganda. Oh, remember, some of the people who have died were government supporters. Well, yeah, no shit. If you've got a police firing into crowds of people, occasionally they're going to hit somebody that they don't mean to hit. It's not like they're all expert marksmen, especially with the training that their state forces are going to get in a state like Venezuela. Years on after they have to slash that budget repeatedly, too. But suffering has mounted and continued to mount. One thing I will say is it looks like the U.S. government is poised to slap more sanctions on Venezuela. I actually oppose this. I think that the country should be allowed to collapse on its own so that nobody there can say, oh, it was evil Uncle Sam, it was those evil imperialistic Americans that were responsible. Right now, when they make up all these crappy stories about, oh, it's a CIA coup, or it's U.S. involvement, as though the sanctions that were already there hurt the economy back when oil sales were high. Right now, nobody really takes that seriously. Certainly not in the rest of Latin America, because it's a farce. It's stupid. Everyone knows that it's fake. It's just an excuse being made by the Maduro regime. But when you come out and say, oh, we're going to put more sanctions on Venezuela, what happens is that that story that is still false begins to take on an air of truth, and it actually gives Maduro more power. Now, I think the idea is they want Maduro to hang around as long as possible. Because that just makes the situation more and more miserable, and they're hoping that that means that instead of like a center-right coalition ousting him eventually, that maybe fanatics will take hold, and then there'll be a death spiral within Venezuela, which means that that oil will stay cheap for a very long time. I see that as rather shifty. I oppose it, and I think that we should leave the situation alone. We should be putting weight on the other Latin American states to get involved, at least diplomatically, and continue to say, yes, indeed, Maduro does need to hold an election immediately. It's like his new excuse is, oh, yeah, I know I forestalled the election, but don't worry, we're going to have one eventually, and then he's trying to change the Constitution so that he doesn't have to do jack shit. And that's really the whole point. It's just, oh, hey, I'll fiddle around with the Constitution. Now, what exactly is that going to have to do with your poverty scenario? What does that have to do with oil prices? Absolutely nothing. It's just it's a ruse. It's a smokescreen for his entire authoritarian regime. Venezuela has begun to collapse. And a lot of people don't even want to admit that that's what's happening. They want a soft, fluffy, happy, optimistic scenario in which Venezuela, in which an election is held, Maduro smiles and gets cheered by the crowd and steps down, and then things magically get better. They're not magically going to get better. The best case scenario right now is that the opposition manages to kill Maduro, the military does not go completely apeshit, and the country forms a new government that addresses some of their, economic problems, which are all caused by socialism. That would be the best case scenario. But even in that best case scenario, you're looking at years and years of continued misery anyway, and instability because of them, because of several factors. You have state-run militias that will take up arms if anything but a far-left socialist is in power. They will take up arms and conduct terrorist attacks. If that happens, they probably will ask the U.S. for help, and it might be justified finally to get involved. But only if the government, seen as legit by most of the population there, has asked us to be there in the first place. Otherwise, no. Let Colombia get involved, let Brazil get involved, let them get anyone involved who they feel is appropriate. If we're not explicitly asked and explicitly welcomed by the majority of the Venezuelans, we should not put so much as one single boot on the ground in the state. We shouldn't even give them military help. It would be a terrible idea because it would piss off all of Maduro's remaining fans. You're still talking about several million people. So that's what really should be done in the state of Venezuela. We should sit back, wait, hope that a government forms that's actually not crummy. But even then, there will be years of continued problems because the oil sales are what propped up their economy in the first place. If you've got an economy that's completely reliant, or more or less completely reliant, upon one export, which is in their case crude oil, and you've got inefficient extraction systems that can barely be maintained because of a chronic shortage of goods and labor, you've got electrical problems, certainly. You've got problems because you're not refining your own fuel. It's difficult to even move the crude around. If you've got all these problems and the oil price collapses, yeah, you're gonna lose a lot of money. Much of their economy is degrading away into nothingness in the state of Venezuela. And I don't, by the way, have a problem with the people of Venezuela. But the best way to piss them off is to get more explicitly involved in the situation and make it where we would be taking a wound and rubbing it with a wool sponge. It's not going to help the situation. It's just going to inflame it. It's going to make it worse. And it's going to get the ire up of even people there that don't really like Maduro towards us, because then they're like, oh, it's between this madman Maduro and mad people in another country. Who are they going to side with? They're going to side with Maduro. At least he's a Venezuelan. That's essentially what slapping more and more sanctions on them will do. It's also probably wouldn't collapse the regime. If anything, it strengthens it a little. The core fans of socialism, people that are maybe slightly less far left, will solidify, become more far left, and then the problem continues to get worse and worse and worse. It devolves, instead of devolving into a short-lived revolution, where political opposition is able to seize power and try to begin reforming the situation, you end up with a total civil war instead, which would be far, far worse, I think, down the road. It would also probably piss off some of the Latin American states. Some of them don't have a problem with us considering further involvement, maybe the Peruvians or the Colombians. But there are others, maybe Bolivia or Brazil, that wouldn't welcome that. No, I don't think they'd be too happy with Uncle Sam if we came marching in. And we don't even have to march in to really piss off people within that region. Just these increased sanctions they're talking about, I think, would be just as bad. The regime will collapse on its own. Centrally run socialist regimes collapse. That's just what happens. Socialism is incapable of functioning long term. As such, we should sit back and do little to nothing. That's about all. Peace out.